Warning: the podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast, the overdose murder of Bobbie Jean Blacka miniseries, episode 4 of 4. Well, David, we are diving into episode 4, which is our fourth and final episode of the overdose murder of Bobbie Jean Blacka. Why don't you tell us what this final episode holds for us?
Well, like we saw in episode 3, we got to see what some of the legal ramifications were. In episode 4, we'll see what the results of that was, if there was any. I don't want to give that away for the listener. But also in episode 4, you get to hear more about Bobbie's personal experience with this case, how it moved him emotionally, the effort he put into it, some of the things he found difficult about it. The listeners by this point really know that Bobbie really speaks from the heart about this, and you can tell that he really had his heart in this investigative work. He had a hunger for that and a drive. So episode 4, we're going to finish really good. This is a good summarization of the case with the results. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and start and finish this conversation with Bobbie.
Okay. Did you ever, after that, were you able to tell her that you were able to make these arrests on her daughter's behalf?
Yes, I was extremely happy to be able to call her and say we have warrants for everybody's arrest. I still can't disclose the names of them, but the warrants are in the books. They're into the computer system. I already have 2 in custody. We're looking for the other 2. They will be criminally charged with murder. I've worked it out with the district attorney. They will be indicted. And that gave her some relief. And she was like, thank God, I'll sleep easier knowing that, the case was solved. And can you tell me what happened? And again, I think that's the hardest part. You put yourself in the shoes of that parent, that grieving parent, and you know that part of them, they don't want to know what happened because it's going to hurt their feelings even more. But you also know that they're so curious to know how it happened and what happened to their child that they want to know. So luckily, it was one of those situations that I never had to go over the details with her. We never had a follow-up conversation where she said, now that the case is adjudicated, it's closed, I want to know detail by detail all of the facts of this case. I never had to have that conversation. I was lucky enough that it was still early enough in the investigation stages that she took solace in the fact that arrests were being made and that I couldn't disclose the details because it was still under investigation and hadn't been heard out in court yet.
Did you ever find out in the end if her husband or if the mother knew any of these suspects? Just in passing?
Yeah, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. John Boy, so he gets arrested, and one of the hurdles when we talk about the judicial system, especially in West Virginia, and again, anybody who's from West Virginia or knows anybody from West Virginia that's on this call, please don't think that I'm putting down West Virginia. That is my home state. I will always be a mountaineer, but there are some judicial problems in West Virginia. In West Virginia, when you arrest somebody, even though they're going to go to a county jail, it's still really a state-run facility. Anytime they're incarcerated, the state will bill the county a jail fee. When I left, I think that was $96 a day, $97 a day that the county had to pay to keep that individual incarcerated. So as a part of alleviating that jail bill, which whenever I left, we were almost $400,000 in the negative is what we owed as a county from incarcerating people. All of the county officials got together and said, we'll solve this problem. We're just going to set extremely low bonds and not put people in jail because we can't afford to do this. Because if we don't pay the jail bill, they're going to cut our state funding as a county and as a municipality, and we won't get state grants. We won't get that grant funding. So they made that decision, and from there on out, the magistrates were setting horribly low bonds. I can't remember what the bonds were on the 4 individuals, but I can tell you that John Boy, not coming from a rich family, he was able to post his bond through a bail bondsman on a first-degree murder charge, and he was out within maybe a month, I think it was. He was out of jail pending his court hearing, his trial, and he wasn't even indicted yet.
Wow.
So, yep, he was out of jail walking around with a first-degree murder charge. So he contacts his attorney. He gets a public defender. He gets defense counsel issued to him through the public defender's office. The public defender calls me and says, we want to play ball, we want to turn state's witness, and we want to cooperate with this investigation. He's willing to come forward as long as you're willing to sign a waiver that, the prosecutor can have some leverage over his case and cut him a deal since he's cooperating with law enforcement. At this point in time, our story is so gray with people that are definitely pathological liars, that have issues with being truthful, that may not even make their court appearance, and they could be the star witness because their statement is the whole reason I'm charging somebody else. Talk to the district attorney. He's like, absolutely, we need a statement. Go in and do a secondary statement with him, and everything that he tells you will be contingent on whether or not we're going to cut a deal with him, depending on how good this statement's going to be. I go in with an audio recorder with his legal counsel present. We do the whole thing out of the way. Hey, he's already represented by legal counsel. We do a Miranda waiver, everything that we need to get all the administrative stuff out of the way. And he goes through and tells me the whole entire story. He confesses to driving the car to Maryland. He's the driver. It was his uncle's car. They did go to that location that was told to me before to pick up heroin. He absolutely refused to give me the dealer's name that he got the heroin off of. He said, these guys are heavy hitters, and if I snitch on them, they will kill me. They will kill me, and I'm not going to do that. He said, you can lock me up and throw away the key, but I'm not going to snitch because if I snitch, I'm as good as dead. So he would not tell me their name. We were never able to identify the dealer that sold in Maryland. He did tell me they come back to the apartment complex, and this is the first time throughout the whole entire story that we actually learned that Christina Pierce was the one that stuck the needle in the victim's arm and administered the lethal dose of heroin. That's the first time that we were able to determine this. When Christina tells me the story, she says somebody helped Bobbie out with shooting up, but I just don't know who did it. And she didn't want to confess to that.
I was going to ask at some point in the process if that ever came out. So that's fantastic to hear.
I do have to ask, was she the CNA?
She was.
I knew it.
Absolutely
I knew
was.
it. I knew when you said CNA, I said to myself, I think that CNA might have been who did that. That's just what I was thinking. So John Boy was honest and told the whole similar story to confession number 4 with Daisy.
Right. So now at this point, we have 4 statements, 4 individual, very different statements from Daisy. We have a statement. Well, actually, I think I did 2 or 3, ultimately 2 or 3 statements from Christina Pierce, and her statements changed a little bit every single time. And then John Boy's statement, there was a lot of pieces and components from Christina and Daisy's story that John Boy told at the exact same time. And I'm like, okay, well, when they told me that, I know that was truthful. But then I asked him about this other stuff, and he's like, either I don't know or that was a lie. So he was able to either substantiate or disprove a lot of the things that come out in their statements. And I think altogether, my interview with him probably lasted 3 hours. I mean, it was a lengthy interview. I mean, we had a lot of audio recording that we just had to keep bringing my laptop with me and downloading audio. And we sent it all up to the prosecutor's office. And ultimately, he had an outstanding probation violation warrant in Pennsylvania. I think it was for a drug charge. I can't be 100% certain. So ultimately, the prosecutor let him go back to Pennsylvania on an extradition charge where Pennsylvania authorities came to West Virginia and picked him up and took him back to Pennsylvania, put him in their division of correction where I can't remember how many years he had to serve for his probation violation. But because he cooperated, our district attorney allowed his West Virginia sentence to run concurrent with what he had in Pennsylvania. What that basically means is those 2 sentences run at the same exact time and they cancel one another out. So if he gets sentenced on November 1st in Pennsylvania, his West Virginia time starts then as well. If he gets 7 years in Pennsylvania but only gets 1 year in West Virginia, in 1 year, he'll have no more time to do in West Virginia. They run those sentences concurrently. So the prosecutor did do that for him since he cooperated with the state and gave us a really good confession, and he agreed to testify. Once he agreed to testify, all of the other defense attorneys cut a deal immediately. They knew that we had somebody that rolled and turned state witness. They also saw the 7 or 8 signed confessions that I had from Daisy and from Christina. They saw the confession and statement that I had from the uncle that put him in the place in the car at the apartment complex partying. I had statements from the neighbors. I mean, we had everything that coincided with evidence, and it all lined up to paint that holistic picture, and we could give the totality of circumstance. In our judicial process, one of the things we do is a felony preliminary hearing in order to determine if there's probable cause to move forward to the higher court, which is circuit court, where we do have a judicial official that does have a law degree, unlike our magistrates. Once we had probable cause that was found on each one of those felony preliminary levels and it was transferred to a higher court, not only did all the defense attorneys knew that we had a solid case, and I'm not bragging on myself, it's just one of the things that helped the case move more fluidly, was because I had that reputation with defense attorneys that they knew that I did my job to the letter of the law. I didn't play dirty law. I didn't charge people with, just circumstantial and speculatory evidence. If I was going to send a case over, I was going to have a good case. And a lot of them, once they found out that I was the lead investigator on the case, they went to their clients and said, the defendants, and said, hey, McKone's on this case. He turned in like an 84-page police report, and I'm not reading through that novel to pick this thing apart. It's very detailed and it's solid. He's got photos. He has statements on top of statements. He turned one of the suspects as a state's witness. There's probable cause found in the felony preliminaries. We've had a true bill of indictment returned from the grand jury. This is not looking good. And you're looking at a murder one. We need to do something about this and cop out and take a plea. And ultimately, most of the people that were involved actually had it pled down from first-degree murder to misdemeanor involuntary manslaughter. It's sad to say, but a lot of those cases were pled down to a misdemeanor offense.
Wow. And like you said, the sad thing is they'll be out in no time. And then the mother is still dealing with the grief of her daughter, and the children are still dealing with the grief of their mother.
Well, I can tell you in West Virginia, we do sliding scale sentencing. So the adjudication report when they were sentenced, I'll go through this. Melissa Stewart, she took a guilty plea for involuntary manslaughter. That's a misdemeanor, so it only offers a maximum of a 1-year sentence in jail. 1 year for this girl losing her life. She took a guilty plea for transporting controlled substance into the state of West Virginia from Maryland. That sentence offers a sliding scale 1 to 15 years at the discretion of the judge. The judge never come back out, nor did the prosecutor come back out and do a press release in the media to say, they've officially been sentenced, here's what they got. Typically on those 1 to 15 year sentences, they always do something small. It's always 3 years, 2 years. It's something on the lower end of that scale. I would not be surprised if she only got 2 or 3 years. And the involuntary manslaughter case was ran concurrently. Remember, that's the ones that are run together. So if she got a 3-year sentence on one and a 1-year sentence on the other with good time, she probably would have been out in 1.5 years, 2 years for this murder case.
Wow. So more time for the transporting controlled substance than the involuntary manslaughter.
Absolutely, because it's a misdemeanor offense in West Virginia. I said before, John Boy, he actually only took a guilty plea for felony accessory to deliver controlled substance, Schedule II narcotic heroin, because he was the driver of the car. He's the one that took him in there. So he took a felony plea on that one, and then they deferred his time to Pennsylvania and let him go back and face his probation violation there. Christina Nicole Pierce, she was in federal custody at the time that the hearing took place, so I'm sure the prosecutor made a deal with the feds to say, we'll let that time run concurrent. Her federal time is going to be way more than what we're going to give her here in West Virginia, so we'll just let that run concurrent. I don't know what happened as a result of that. And Daisy Stewart, she had a status hearing, and her hearing status was pending court evaluation before the hearing was set, and I never had any follow-up disposition on that, so I don't know what she got. I would venture to say, knowing the way our legal system works, she probably received a probation before judgment. She was probably released directly to the parole and probation office to where she had to, not use any narcotics and stay out of trouble for a set period of time, and then her charges were going to go away as well. So they were all extremely light sentences, given the totality and the seriousness of this case.
Wow. And that's so disheartening to think that the trafficking controlled substance bears more weight than somebody's life.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that's just really a slap in the face to the family and to the victim. And I know ultimately Bobbie Jean made that choice, but still that doesn't justify those people getting that kind of sentence on her life. Did any of these suspects, aside of Daisy breaking down crying, specifically Christina, did anyone ever just show any remorse of, I really hate that happened to her?
John Boy did. I think he was sincere when he said that. And, he kind of had a moment where he got choked up and said, I was just trying to have a good time. And, we were going to party. And, think about it. If I hadn't gone and got them all heroin, she'd still be alive. So he did have that moment of reflection in front of me. And he did. Now, again, I don't know if it was for show because he was being recorded. At this point in time when he's doing this statement, he deliberately leans across the table into the audio recorder and addresses, I just want to let the judge and the prosecutor know that I'm very, very sorry for this. So was it something his attorney told him? Was it something that was coaxed? Did he do it for show, or was he sincerely remorseful? That I don't know. But Melissa Stewart at one point in time, on top of, saying, it's not my fault, she deliberately said, that's on Bobbie. She's the one that wanted to get high, and that's on her, not on me. That's her problem, is what she said in the interview. She was not remorseful at all. She said that it was her choice to use, and she's dead because she made a choice, and that was the way that she looked at it.
Wow.
It's that selfishness that you see, whether it's that manner of death or other. It's all for the narcissism is so strong usually in that interview.
Well, it is. And then you have Bobbie Jean thinking these are her friends or acquaintances or whatever. And to know that that's how they're looking at her. Like your life really doesn't matter enough. If you die, you die. You're the one wanting to shoot up, and not realizing that they're also the pot calling the kettle black, doing the same thing.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. She said that several times. She's the one that's a heroin addict, and it's like, but you're addicted to heroin as well. How can you use terminology that's just so cold? When you have the same exact substance abuse problem and you know what the grip of heroin is on an individual, if not, you wouldn't be using it. You wouldn't be addicted to it. And I think that this adjudication report, ultimately what happened in court with the way that the case was handled in the sentencing, that was my last follow-up call to the victim's mother. And when I had to explain to them, well, actually, she called me and said, I did read the local newspaper and saw what they were found guilty of. And the mother, no fault to her, but she was furious with me. She was like, how could you let this happen? How could you let them only get a year in jail? And I can't believe this. And I just had to explain to her and be very empathetic to say, Mrs. Blacka, I understand you're furious, but you have to understand, once I make the arrest and I toss this over to the court system, I have no say in it. I have no involvement in it. I absolutely had no say in what their sentencing was. It was no fault of mine. This was all handled in the court system. There was nothing I could do about it. But she was very upset and very bitter, and rightfully so. I can understand where she was coming from, but how do you pass that blame and say, I don't want you going, the rest of your life hating me for it when I had no involvement in this. It was out of my control.
And I think at that moment, her mother probably is just trying to hate anybody that she can because she's so distraught, and somebody has to take the blame. And I think possibly ultimately she knew you didn't have a decision on how those sentences were handled down, but she wasn't going to get to the judge or any jury. You were as close as it was going to get.
Yeah, and at that point, being emotionally intelligent enough to know that she's grief-stricken, I was willing to allow her to use me as an emotional punching bag and just unload on me. And yes, ma'am, I understand and I'm very, very sorry, and just kind of be remorseful and just let her kind of offload on somebody. Like you said, she's not going to call the judge's chambers. So I was more than willing to be that person for her to just unload on to feel a little bit better.
Well, and that goes along with, I talked about how you have to have that hunger and that drive to do this kind of work. And, part of the deal that you truly sign up for is just what you described, is that you're the only contact these people have with the justice system. And it's a scary, frightening, brutal place. And they fortunately, in most cases, have not had to deal with it before because nothing's happened. And if it means giving a piece of you or I up to help them get through that, that was just part of what I signed up for. And I took the same attitude you did, as I'm here for you.
And I think that pales in comparison to what their family is going through.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's ironic too when they're talking about it was her choice, and then they're talking about, the science is very clear on what addiction is that the word choice is actually pretty poor because of what happens inside somebody's brain chemically once a drug like that takes over, is that the choice thing is pretty much out the window. And people have to understand that. And that's where you have to try to find some room for compassion with that, is that to sit there and say that it was a free will choice is really kind of crazy at that point. That's not even up for debate anymore. But so that was the last contact that you had with that mother, right?
Yeah, and of course, she went on just to tell me, we had to break it to the husband and to the kids, and the kids are devastated, and they ask me constantly, Grandma, when's Mommy coming home, and when's Mommy coming back? And of course, I'm on the phone breaking down, crying with her because I'm thinking about my kids as a law enforcement officer and as a father, and all I can keep saying is I'm just so sorry. I'm just sorry that this happened. And what do you say in those circumstances to console somebody? Because you truly can't say anything that's going to make it better.
There just aren't any words.
You just open those ears, and
that's the time to listen.
Exactly. I think that's the important part too. And again, when we're talking about the fact that those were relatively light sentences and what we wouldn't want to have, because we've covered this in other cases before too, you're right that we have to work within the system that's in front of us, and we have to learn to just respect what those decisions are. Now, that's harder for a family member to take, but I would say that in Kentucky, because of the difficulty in doing a drug overdose death, is that I'd probably have a little gratitude for even getting that far, because it's so difficult. And again, the only luck we've really had here is with those federal prosecutions, and they are extremely intensive. But that works that out really good in the idea that you at least had some kind of emotion on that, and that's not true universally. There's going to be people across the country listen to this that have had family members in that same place, and they're probably frustrated right now with the idea that there's no sense of justice to that in the end. And it's so difficult, so difficult.
Well, and ultimately, I think it would have played out differently if we had made it to a jury trial. You know, Dave and I had the opportunity to talk earlier last week, and we were talking a lot about testifying in court, and that was something that I just absolutely thrived on. I love to get up in the jury box. A lot of officers, it may make them, on pins and needles. They may be extremely nervous and have anxiety. I thrived on it. I absolutely loved it because I connected with the jury very well, and I love the fact that I could present the facts of my case because I worked very hard on every single case. I wanted all my evidence submitted, and I would make it very clear I did this by the book, step by step, in accordance with local, state, and federal law. And that's why they never liked going up against me in court, because they knew that I was going to present a solid case. And I think if this was presented before a jury of their peers in a small town like that, a small county, I think there would have been a lot more political sway to say, all right, there was a guilty conviction returned. We're going to have to issue serious prison time for this, because it's only the second murder case that we ever had pop up in my county, in my jurisdiction, within probably a 20-year period. So there was not very many homicides, that was back there. So the fact this made the paper as a murder charge was big news, really big news in that community. So I think, that's why the defense attorneys were smart enough to say, we have to plea this out, because if we go to jury trial, these guys are going to be paying with a lot of their life going to prison for quite some time. I would have liked to have seen the difference, to go back. You always say, I would have liked to have seen how that turned out if it was a jury trial. It would have been interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's the way to put it, because you really can't tell what you're going to get. I remember I had years ago when I was a college student at Eastern Kentucky University, I had an instructor, and her name I think was Lucille Roebuck. And if I get that wrong, I hate that, but she had been a judge, and she said one night in class, she goes, the two things that terrified her in life was a volunteer fireman on a run and a jury trial, because she said you just didn't know. And I apologize to all my volunteer firemen out there that are listening, but jury trials they're unique, and just as much as you can get a hope up that you'll get a different result, I've seen some phenomenal stuff come back on jury trials. It's the system we have, and that's the peer evaluation that's representative of the community.
But then you may have some on the flip side looking at it like Melissa did, saying, well, that was her choice. Why should people be charged with her murder? That was her choice.
There's a certain
there's that thin line there.
There's a crapshoot to it.
Yes.
And
yeah.
But I will.
We saw that a lot. We had when we would do our grand jury indictments, obviously, they go through the jury selection process just the same as what you would for the jury trial. And sometimes you go in there, and you're presenting these cases that you think are solid cases, and these jurors for grand jury indictments asking you just crazy questions, because all of them have watched way too many episodes of like the first 24 and CSI, and they're like, oh, did you get lab results? Did you get forensic evidence? Did you get a confession? Did you get all these things? And you're trying to explain to them what the law is and, the evidence that you did get, but no, I did not get forensic results and I did not get a confession, but I have, stuff on audio recording and video recording. I have 20 witnesses, and they're like, no true bill of indictment. We're going to say that there's not probable cause. And sometimes it does throw you a curveball. Oh,
it does. It's the CSI effect. Where people are overly educated on television and movies, and they try to apply that to real life.
That's what I would say a lot. I know we're law enforcement, but we can't solve the whole entire case within 40 minutes with commercial breaks, too.
No, exactly. Well, moving on a little bit, since we're talking about addiction and substance abuse, and you said that it's impacted your family, I can say that it's impacted mine more than once and had some really bad, tragic results in that. What do we tell people then from our point of view, me having, both of us are now exited the formal part of the game, but what do we tell people that may have a loved one that's going through an addiction issue? What's some advice we can give them?
Well, with me, I really was very candid to humanize the badge. I was very open with myself. I didn't mind sharing things, where I'd messed up in life. I didn't mind sharing family information. And of course, I had a lot of cop colleagues that were very robotic, very true alpha male personalities. Like, I will not tell them my first name. I will not tell them if I have kids. I take my wedding ring off whenever I go to work because I don't want suspects knowing whether or not I'm married. I've had that to where they do not want to disclose anything about their personal life. I was the kind of person that I would go, and sit with people, or, it wouldn't be past me, to hug people. Obviously, officer safety being paramount and being number one. But, I would hug people in uniform. I would let them know what my first name was. I didn't have problems sharing myself and my stories. And that's a lot of the stories that I did share, especially with Miss Blacka. Miss Blacka, I have, 5 or 6 family members right now that are addicted to heroin, cocaine, prescription pain medication. My father had an issue with alcohol and cocaine and marijuana. But yet my brother and I are both cops, so it's one of those things that I could share myself with them to let them know, although I'm not in your shoes right at this moment, I do understand where you're coming from, and I am here for you as a human being, not as a law enforcement officer. Excellent.
That's a whole nother level of trust with somebody, is that, we call that vulnerability-based trust. And you have to give a little bit of yourself to get that. That's a fantastic way to develop a rapport.
Well, and I think then it humanizes, Bobbie, you, so that they see that you're not, quote unquote, above the law. You're just like them. Right. And I think a lot of people in the community think, well, if they're the police, they're above the law, laws don't apply to them, they must have a perfect family, they don't know what we're going through, they just say they know what we're going through, they're probably looking down on us because we're addicts or our family's addicts, but not realizing the same thing applies to you. You're no different.
And in North Carolina, I don't know if Kentucky has this, but we have what's called Crisis Intervention Team, CIT. I was a crisis intervention instructor for the Alliance of Mental Illness. And I can't tell you how many times I've been to suicide calls where they've called in and say, hey, I believe I'm suicidal. And we'd roll our mobile crisis unit. And I would go out there and talk to them as like a one-on-one negotiator liaison capacity and sit down and find out that they were in the middle of going through a custody battle and divorce. And I would sit down with them, and obviously they didn't have any weapons or anything that I'd fear for my safety, but I could put my arm around them and say, look, man, I've been through a divorce. I've been through a custody battle. I know where you're coming from. And look at me. Mine was 7 years ago, 8 years ago, whatever the case may be. And I had some pretty dark times myself, but I come out okay. Like, things can get better, but that's the way that I policed. And like Dave and I were talking earlier, maybe it's because I started off in the jail and I had to develop that rapport, or it meant that I had 100 inmates that didn't like me and I was in the middle of them, and that was no good. So, maybe I was able to do that, but I didn't mind being vulnerable and letting them see that humanistic side of myself.
Yeah, I think you certainly get people to open up to you more when you're more real with them, instead of, I'm not going to tell you my name or anything about me. And I know that a lot of people, for their officer safety, don't want a lot of that out there. But at the same time, you have to realize that those people, they're people too, and they're just like you, and you don't have to be so rigid with them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess it depends on where you live too. Would I have been that way in a larger city? Maybe not. But being in a town where I was born and raised, grew up, played football, went to high school, knew these people, they knew me already. It wasn't any secret that my first name was Bobbie. When I would go to calls and I would have rookies that weren't from my town, we had several that got hired from Maryland, and we would go on calls and they'd be like, hey, Bobbie, listen to this, listen to that. And my rookie would look at me and say, you let him call you by your first name? I went to high school with him. He knows me.
This is back home.
It was a very different environment from me being from a small town as well.
Yeah, I think that certainly plays a lot into it because, they do know you and they probably had that respect growing up or knew your family. And so you're just, well, to some of the old timers, you're one of theirs,
Well, I can't thank you enough for going through this case. And it probably won't be the last one we cover, is that I've thought about maybe trying to get an episode up on that federal angle I talked about, and I might start looking at that. But been a fantastic description of a very rare type of death investigation that makes its way into the criminal justice system is probably the best way to put that. So,
well, and it's certainly sad because it was a preventable one, but when you get drug into that lifestyle, it's clearly not as preventable as Bobbie Jean's family would have liked.
Yeah, and I think talking about this I think it's important for Bobbie Jean. I think it's important just for a tragic ending to a life that maybe had some potential. And again, that's what we do on this podcast, I think, is to make sure that her name isn't forgotten in just a list of a statistical thousands that are out there too.
Right. And that's the thing. I think, if a community can get behind a noble cause to do some type of substance abuse advocacy in your jurisdiction, if you're from a small town like I am and you have nothing set up in place like this, I think it's good if you're one of the pillars of your community, or you can rally people together and get something started. I think get ahead of it because before it becomes a problem in your neighborhood if it's something that you're not seeing. I'll tell you how gripping this substance abuse stuff is and how peer pressure is and just the psychology of it is after Bobbie Jean had become unconscious, unresponsive, and she was on the floor of the bedroom laying down on her back, and they had already thrown the water on her, and they were unsure if she was breathing and didn't have a pulse. They all went out to the living room and closed the door and were talking about what they were going to do to clean this mess up. And that's when the talk come out, if we call the ambulance, the cops are going to show up and we're all going to go to jail. Let's just leave her in here and we'll flee the scene and take the drugs with us and we can deal with this later. Even though Daisy was there and it was Daisy's apartment, you would think common sense would kick in and she would say, wait a minute, this is my apartment and there's a dead body in it. You guys are going to leave and pin this on me. We're not going out like that. But they had this talk. And Melissa was loading up another syringe with the same exact heroin that just killed Bobbie Jean. And she shoots up and she looks at Daisy and says, do you want to take a hit? And Daisy said, I only ever smoke weed. I don't use heroin. And they were like, come on, get high with us. The same heroin that just killed her friend. She stuck out her arm and said, I've never used it before, but go ahead and shoot me up too.
Oh, wow.
That is the significance. And when I heard that, when Daisy told me that was probably the craziest aspect of this story, that you just saw your friend die and said, put that same stuff in my veins because of peer pressure.
Wow. Did you all ever find out, was it something that was in it or was it just too much for Bobbie Jean since she hadn't used in some time?
So, of course, asking Christina, how much did you load in the syringe? How much did you give her? We never were able to uncover that. All we know is that the level in the toxicology report of opium that was in Bobbie Jean's system was consistent with being a lethal dose. The toxicology cannot break down as far as like fentanyl because fentanyl is also in the same classification. It's also a narcotic analgesic. So it doesn't break them down by different drugs. All it shows was there was an increased level of opium in her system. So we don't know if it was laced with fentanyl or something different, but the only thing she had in her system was alcohol, marijuana, and heroin. So I don't know if it was laced with anything else.
Wow. But just to know that Melissa and Daisy would use it while their friend is just the next room over with the door closed. And just trying to get that one more last one in before they leave and leave poor Bobbie Jean laying in the floor.
Well, our thoughts and prayers with Bobbie Jean's family,
that's
for
horribly
sure.
sad.
And again, thank you again for spending the time with us. And
and not only that, thank you also for being an officer that was reaching out to those families and empathizing with them and listening to them and letting them chew your ears, so to speak, when they had nobody else to yell at and listen to. Those officers, I hope there's more like you. One would hope there is, but thank you so much for offering that to your community and to these people that some would think they really didn't deserve it. But Bobbie Jean was a person and she's her family's loved one and they've lost them. So, but thank you again for being that officer that everybody would like to see out there. And thank you also for taking your time to talk with us today and share this story of how you dealt with this.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, which is our website, and it has show notes for imagery and audio and video files related to the cases you're going to hear. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and YouTube, which has closed caption available for those that are hearing impaired. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. Subscribe to the Murder Police podcast and set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.